Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was one of those blustery evenings in late October, when the London fog arrived early, curling like a damp grey serpent through the lamplight outside Baker Street. I remember it clearly, for Holmes and I had just returned from a brief sojourn in the countryside, a trip that had done my friend little good. He had been moody and discontent, starving for a problem worthy of his prodigious talents. He had not yet removed his travelling coat when the familiar rap-rap of hasty knuckles struck our door. Mrs. Hudson, with her usual quiet efficiency, ushered in a man who, even in the poor gaslight of the sitting-room, struck me as profoundly discomposed. His cheeks were pallid, and his moustache quivered with a restrained nervousness. "Mr. Holmes," the gentleman said breathlessly, removing his bowler hat with trembling fingers. "You are my last hope." Holmes regarded him with that cool, piercing gaze which had unsettled many a criminal and calmed many a frantic client. "Sit, sir. You are a solicitor, or were recently at chambers, judging by the ink on your cuffs. You are unmarried Catholic, and you play the violin badly." The man blinked rapidly. How could you possibly? Holmes waved the matter away with a flick of his hand. "Details, Mr. Rivington, Lionel Rivington. I am employed at Godwin, Page and Halloway in Lincoln's Inn." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And what impossible crime brings you here at this hour?" Rivington swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "It's murder, Mr. Holmes. But the circumstances, Lord, I don't even know where to begin." "The beginning is traditional," Holmes said, motioning for me to sit with notebook in hand. "Proceed." Rivington leaned forward. "The incident occurred last night at Greystone Grange in Surrey. The deceased is Sir Felix Torrington. My firm has represented his interests for years, which is how I became involved. I was at the estate on unrelated business when it happened." "Go on," Holmes murmured, eyes gleaming. Sir Felix had retired early, as was his custom. At approximately 10 o'clock, one of the footmen noticed an odd smell coming from the master's study. Burning wax, they said, mixed with some other pungent scent. When they forced the door open, they found Sir Felix slumped over his desk. A candle had melted all the way down, burned completely askew as though leaning toward the floor, and he was dead. "What was the cause of death?" I asked. "An incision, doctor, across the jugular. Clean, precise, almost surgical. But the door was locked from the inside, and the only window was bolted. There were no signs of forced entry, and none of the servants heard anything beyond the usual creaks of the old house." "A locked room mystery," Holmes murmured, rubbing his chin. "Please continue. There's more." "The candle, Mr. Holmes. It had been affixed to the desk in a peculiar brass holder. The wax had melted not straight down, as candles should, but in a distinct curve, dripping in a line that led toward the floor. And at the end of that trail, on the carpet, was a small pool of wax, but no candle, no second holder, just wax. A crooked candle," Holmes said softly, his voice nearly inaudible. "Yes," Rivington whispered, "and in that study, aside from the corpse and the mess of wax, there was nothing disturbed, nothing missing. And yet, Sir Felix's final letter, which I had drafted earlier that day and seen him sign, had vanished." Holmes rose and paced to the hearth. "A man is killed, his throat slit in a manner suggesting planning, confidence, even medical expertise. The room is sealed from within, and the only anomalies are a missing letter and a crooked candle." "Ding! Knew it was beyond the constables," Rivington said desperately. "They are already questioning the butler and threatening the housemaid. I overheard one officer suggest the killer slipped through the chimney." Holmes turned suddenly. "Mr. Rivington, do you believe anyone in that household wished Sir Felix harm?" Rivington hesitated. "He was a difficult man, certainly. Stern, inflexible. He had recently altered his will again. There was tension with his nephew, Giles Torrington, something to do with debts and a refused inheritance. And the companion, Miss Adela March, seemed unusually distraught even before the body was found. Interesting. You shall return to Surrey tonight," Holmes said briskly. "We will accompany you. Doctor, pack for the night. I believe the countryside may finally offer us the sort of mental challenge I've been craving." "Of course. Holmes," I said, already rising. Rivington exhaled with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. The constables won't be pleased, I imagine. Inspector Garrow has already set his sights on the valet, but I'll make the necessary arrangements." As he left, Holmes returned to his armchair, fingers laced and eyes closed. I recognized the posture. It meant he was already deep in thought. "You are troubled by something," I ventured. "The candle, Watson," he said. "It was crooked, frowned. You find that significant?" "I find nothing insignificant," Holmes replied, eyes still shut. "But consider, wax melting in a perfect arc. Gravity, heat, angle. Something in that room distorted the natural course of combustion. That alone tells us the crime was staged, or worse, that it was designed not merely to hide, but to mislead." I stared at the coals in the grate, trying to picture the scene. "And the missing letter." "More important than the body, I suspect," Holmes murmured. "A man like Sir Felix doesn't die without a final word. And someone made sure we would never read it." He opened one eye and gave me a sly glance. "Come, Watson, the game has begun." Chapter 2. Holmes and Watson's first discussion. We departed Baker Street just after 10 that night, the train from Waterloo bound for Surrey, wheezing like some weary beast through the thickening mist. Holmes had been unusually silent for the bulk of the journey, his lean frame wrapped in his greatcoat, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes staring unseeingly out the fog-smeared carriage window. For my part, I found myself unusually restless. There was something in Rivington's account, the locked door, the clean cut, the curved trail of wax, that clawed at the corners of logic. I had seen many a strange murder alongside Holmes, but something about this one had the eerie stamp of nightmare about it. "Holmes," I said at last, when the silence grew too heavy to bear, "do you truly believe the candle is the key to this affair?" He stirred. "My dear Watson, the candle is not merely a detail. It is a deliberate message." "A message?" He nodded, not looking at me. "Consider, candles burn downward, influenced only by heat and gravity. For wax to deviate in a pronounced arc suggests external manipulation. A slanting surface, a draft, a deliberate angle. Yet the trail leads nowhere. A melted stub is expected, but here only a waxy crescent and its puddled conclusion. That suggests removal. Someone took the evidence, Watson." "But the killer couldn't have left the room," I objected. "The door was locked from within, the window bolted. You heard Rivington. There was no chimney, only a narrow vent far too small for any person. Holmes turned to me now, his grey eyes sharp. Just so. And yet the evidence suggests presence, action, departure. I frowned. It's impossible. Precisely, he said with sudden animation, tapping the window pane with one gloved finger. Which is why it must be solved. The carriage rattled into darkness again, the gas lamps outside barely visible. Holmes spoke in a softer tone. You must learn, Watson, never to accept impossibility. The moment we accept that, we abdicate reason and fall prey to illusion. The locked room, the vanished candle, the missing letter, each is a fragment of a larger intent, and somewhere in those details lies a design. You believe the killer left a message then? Perhaps. Or a misdirection. Sometimes the two are one and the same. We arrived at the tiny station of Greystone Holt shortly before midnight, and were met by a gaunt footman in a frock coat 2 sizes too large, holding a lantern and wringing his cap nervously. He introduced himself as Pearson, and informed us that a carriage had been sent by the housekeeper. The journey to Greyston Grange was brief, but I recall the cold creeping into my boots as we travelled up the winding drive. The house, when it emerged from the trees, was a forbidding stone structure with narrow gables and tall chimneys. One upper window still glowed faintly, but the rest loomed black and silent like a mausoleum. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candle soot and old tobacco. The housekeeper, a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Hapwell, met us at the door. She showed no surprise at our late arrival. Clearly Rivington had sent word ahead, and led us down a long hall lined with dusty oil portraits to the study of the late Sir Felix. "You'll find it untouched since last night, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice pinched and precise. "Inspector Garrow was displeased, but I've kept the servants out, as requested by Mr. Rivington." "Excellent," Holmes murmured. The study door stood open, and Holmes paused, on the threshold like a priest before an altar. I stepped past him and took in the room with a fresh sense of dread. Sir Felix's body had been removed, but the stain on the carpet near the writing desk remained, dark, dried, and jagged. The room itself was richly appointed, bookshelves lining one wall, a velvet armchair beside the fireplace, and the massive oak desk where the murder had taken place. But what drew the eye was the strange trail of hardened wax. It began on the desk, just beside a brass inkwell, and curved in a smooth, unnatural arc toward the right edge. From there, droplets marked the floor in a slow descent toward the rug. A small puddle of wax, no more than a saucer's worth, rested at the edge of the stain, but there was no sign of the candle that had made it. Holmes crouched beside the desk and examined the brass holder. It was bolted into the wood, immovable and empty. "No wax residue here," he said thoughtfully, "which means the candle was not left to burn to its base. It was lifted before. The wax cooled, neatly, deliberately. I bent to examine the trail. Then someone removed it. After the murder?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the bookshelves, running a hand along the spines, stopping twice to examine minute impressions in the dust. He made no comment, but I noted a flicker of interest cross his face. He turned next to the window and tested the latch. bolted as reported, and no sign of tampering. Curious." Mrs. Hapwell reappeared in the doorway. "If you require anything, Mr. Holmes—" "Yes," Holmes interrupted, standing. "I wish to speak to Miss Adela March at first light, and the nephew, Giles Torrington. Miss March is still in her chambers, but I shall summon her when she wakes. As for Mr. Torrington, he left this morning." "Left?" Holmes's tone sharpened. "He said he had urgent business in London and would return tomorrow." Holmes looked at me briefly before turning back to the desk. "Very well. That will be all, Mrs. Hapwell." She departed, and I watched as Holmes knelt once more near the wax trail. He held a match to one of the droplets, watching how it blackened and shriveled. "Not tallow," he muttered. "Beeswax, unusual for a writing candle, and lavender oil. Yes, mixed into the wax." I inhaled. There was indeed a faint scent, floral and a touch bitter, like dried herbs crushed beneath a heel. "Do you suppose it was meant to mask something?" I asked. Holmes looked up. "Or to announce something. The killer wanted the candle noticed, Watson, and they succeeded." He rose and dusted off his knees. "Come, we will rise early. I wish to see Miss March before she has time to prepare a version of the truth." As we returned to our chambers in silence, I glanced once more at the darkened study. The wax trail gleamed faintly in the candlelight, crooked, unnatural, as though beckoning us into madness. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. At dawn, a pale mist still clung to the grounds of Greystone Grange. From the window of my guest-room, I watched the morning fog drift between rows of clipped hedges and skeletal trees. The estate bathed in a colourless hush. The events of the previous evening haunted my thoughts, especially that bizarre trail of wax curving like a question mark through the gloom of Sir Felix's study. Holmes was already dressed and waiting when I emerged from my chamber. He offered no morning pleasantries. His mind was clearly racing, his energy heightened in that familiar razor-edged way it only ever was when a puzzle of exceptional complexity had seized him. "Miss March is expecting us," he said without preamble. We found the companion seated in a modest sitting-room, dressed in black and visibly composed, though her hands betrayed her. A slight tremble of the fingers, just enough to betray the turmoil behind her otherwise steady expression. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with an austere beauty and a voice like water running over stones, clear, cool, and deliberate. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted. "You wish to speak of Sir Felix?" Holmes inclined his head. "You were among the last to see him alive, Miss March. Your perspective may shed light on what others have missed." She folded her hands in her lap. "It was a quiet evening. Sir Felix retired early. He took his supper in the study and asked not to be disturbed." "Was that unusual?" Holmes asked. "No. He valued his solitude, especially after correspondence. He had written several letters that day, including one to his nephew. He instructed me to burn the drafts. I did so." "Did you see the final versions?" Holmes asked. "No, only the one he had me draft earlier, the letter to Mr. Rivington regarding changes to his will." "Ah." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "That letter has vanished," she blinked. "Vanished!" It was not among his effects, neither on the desk nor in his pockets, nor among his other papers. Miss March's composure cracked for the briefest moment. "He placed it in the desk drawer after sealing it. I saw him do it." "Which drawer?" The top left. He was very particular. Holmes made a mental note, then shifted direction. "Tell me, Miss March, what was your impression of Giles Torrington?" She hesitated. "He is volatile, ambitious. Sir Felix disapproved of his lifestyle. Gambling, fast companions, poor investments. The estate had already been rescued twice from ruin on his account. But he stood to inherit nonetheless." She nodded. "Until last week. Sir Felix told me he intended to alter the will. He didn't trust his nephew with the Grange. He said it would burn in that boy's hands." Holmes's eyes flickered. "So the new will, if it existed, would be inconvenient to Mr. Torrington." "Extremely. And to you, Miss March?" Her eyes met Holmes's with quiet steel. "I have no claim. Sir Felix paid me fairly. I asked nothing more." Holmes rose. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." We stepped into the corridor. I turned to him. "She's hiding something." "Undoubtedly," Holmes said, "but not necessarily about the murder." We proceeded directly to the study. Holmes had requested it remain undisturbed again, and now he set about a more exacting examination. He moved like a cat, silent and deliberate, brushing his fingers along the desk, the bookshelves, even the lower panels of the wall. At the writing desk, he tested each drawer. All opened smoothly, save for the top left, which resisted slightly. He drew it open and peered inside. "Empty," I said. "Not quite," Holmes replied. He removed the drawer completely and held it to the light. There, barely visible against the wood grain, was a single dark thread. He handed it to me. Silk. Black. Torn. I examined it. From a sleeve? Or a glove? He turned back to the desk and examined the brass candle holder again. Then, using a magnifying glass, he traced the line of wax residue down to the floor. "Note this, Watson. There is no wax splashed on the side of the desk. The trail is clean. That suggests the candle did not fall naturally. It was guided, held, perhaps until it reached the rug, then removed." "Why go to such trouble?" I asked. "To suggest a time of death," Holmes murmured. "Or rather, to obscure it. A candle burns at a predictable rate. If one wished to manufacture an alibi, one could light a candle, leave the scene, and let its demise suggest the hour. But the candle is gone. Precisely. The killer knew it would incriminate as much as deceive." He moved to the bookshelves again. "Yesterday, I noticed faint indentations here. Dust disturbed. Yet none of the books have been touched, except these." He pulled 2 volumes from the shelf. Laws of Chancery Reform and Memoirs of a Prison Surgeon. Between them was a narrow gap, and in that space Holmes retrieved a small folded scrap. It was scorched at the edges, but the wax seal was intact. Holmes peeled it open with care. "What is it?" I asked. He read silently, then handed it to me. The note was brief. The ink smudged, the signature illegible. But the contents were chilling. "You cannot hide it forever. The truth will be known. If not by you, then through fire," Holmes said. Nothing for a moment. Then, "We now have threat, motive, and an attempt at cover-up. But the deeper question, Watson, is not who, nor how, but why the candle? Why such an elaborate symbol? You think it's symbolic? I think it's theatrical. Like a stage illusion, a simple trick meant to dazzle, while the hand does its real work elsewhere." He tapped the empty brass holder once more. "Let us find the magician behind the trick." We exited the study as footsteps echoed on the stairwell. Inspector Garrow, red-faced and barrel-chested, arrived with 2 constables in tow. His moustache bristled at the sight of Holmes. "I've heard you've been interfering again, Mr. Holmes," he said stiffly. Holmes smiled thinly. "Only seeking truth, Inspector." "Well, truth says it's the valet. Blood on his cuff, and he's missing a glove. That's good enough for me, is it?" Holmes said, tone now cool. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain why the candle is missing." Garrow blinked. "What candle?" Holmes didn't answer. He merely turned away and began ascending the stairs. "Where are you going?" Garrow barked. "To question the butler, the maid, and anyone else who believes in tidy answers. Good day, Inspector." I followed, suppressing a smile. The wax trail was growing longer, deeper, and Holmes was already several steps ahead of us all. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. By midday, Holmes had commandeered the small drawing-room at Greystone Grange as an informal interview chamber. The servants had been instructed to remain within earshot, and Inspector Garrow, still smouldering over Holmes's intrusion, had reluctantly allowed the great detective to pursue his distractions, so long as it did not interfere with the real police work. Holmes naturally ignored the stipulation entirely. I found myself seated in the corner, notebook in hand, while Holmes stood by the window, arms folded behind his back, his gaze distant and calculating as the first of the household staff was summoned. The butler arrived first. "Mr. Needham," Holmes said without preamble, "you were in charge of closing up the house that evening?" "Yes, sir," said Needham, a thin, pale man with a stooped spine and perpetually down-turned eyes. "I checked all windows, drew the curtains, and ensured the side doors were bolted." "And you found nothing out of place?" "No, sir. The study was shut. His lordship had given orders not to be disturbed." "You did not see the candle in question?" "No, sir, though I did light the others earlier. Beeswax, sir, on Miss March's instructions." Holmes tilted his head. "Miss March instructed you to change the candles?" "Yes. She said Sir Felix had developed a sensitivity to the cheaper tallow candles. The scent from the lavender beeswax was gentler on his breathing." Holmes nodded. "Were you fond of Sir Felix?" A pause. "He was a strict employer, but fair, private, didn't speak unless there was reason." "Did he keep valuables in the study?" "Only his correspondence. The safe is in the library." "Was the desk ever locked?" "No, sir. Sir Felix believed in the strength of keys, not drawers." Holmes waved him off. "Thank you, Mr. Needham." As the butler left, Holmes turned to me and said softly, "The man speaks little, but he notices more than he lets on." Next came the maid, a mousy girl named Clara Dimmock, barely 20, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You discovered the body?" Holmes asked gently. "Yes, sir," she sniffled. "I brought the morning tea as usual." When he didn't answer, I knocked again. Then I fetched Mr. Needham. "Did anything seem different in the room?" I don't know, sir. Just the smell. Wax and something sharp, like burnt herbs." "You didn't touch anything?" "No, sir. I just screamed." "Did Sir Felix have visitors the day before?" Her eyes flicked nervously. "Mr. Torrington, sir. He came early in the afternoon. They argued, loud. Then he left, red in the face. And Miss March? She stayed upstairs all evening. I brought her tea at 9:30. She seemed pale, but quiet. Holmes nodded. That will be all. Fled the room like a spooked rabbit. 2 pieces fall into place, Holmes murmured. The scent was no accident. It was noticed by more than one pair of nostrils, which means it was meant to be. Inspector Garrow barged into the room then, looking thoroughly put out. You've had your fun, Holmes, but I've a signed statement. From the valet, blood on his cuff, missing glove, prior grievance over wages. The motive's clear. Holmes turned slowly. And how, Inspector, do you explain the clean slit to the jugular, performed with precision unlikely for a valet? Luck. Desperation. Holmes smiled thinly. You're describing a brawl, not a surgical incision. Before Garrow could retort, the door opened again. Miss Adela March stepped in without invitation, composed as ever. I understand you're questioning the staff, Mr. Holmes, she said coolly. May I remind you they've been under strain? Of course, Holmes said, but the truth is a demanding guest. She ignored the remark. Mr. Torrington has returned. Holmes brightened. Capital. Do bring him in. She hesitated. He is not in the best temper. All the better. Moments later, Giles Torrington strode into the room. He was the very picture of aristocratic disdain, fair-haired, broad-shouldered, with the gaunt, handsome lines of a man who drank too much and thought too little. His walking-stick clacked sharply on the floor as he entered. "Holmes, is it?" he said, voice tight with irritation. "Here to root through our family skeletons?" Holmes gave a courteous nod. "Only the ones that bleed, Mr. Torrington." "Where were you between 9 and 10 on the night your uncle died?" His nostrils flared. "In my room. Reading." "Alone?" "Yes. No servants to corroborate. I don't require nursemaids, Mr. Holmes." Holmes ignored the bluster. "You argued with Sir Felix the afternoon prior to his death." "I did, and I regret nothing." "What was the cause?" Giles sneered. "He was altering his will, removing me, said he'd had enough of my ways, that I'd squander the Grange within a year. I told him he was a bitter old man who never understood anyone not born in powdered wigs." "Did you threaten him?" "I said he'd regret it." "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Your glove is torn." Giles blinked. "I caught it on the gate latch. What of it?" Holmes didn't press. "Do you recognize this?" He held up the scorched note we had found between the books. Giles paled. "Where did you get that?" "In the study." I didn't write it, but you recognize it." He swallowed. "My uncle received one like it a week ago. Anonymous. I thought it was nonsense. Blackmail, maybe. You didn't think to mention this." "I was trying not to be disinherited." Holmes studied him a moment, then turned away. "Thank you, Mr. Torrington. That will be all." As Giles exited, Holmes stood still, unmoving, like a statue carved of thought. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall the Greek play we once saw in Bloomsbury? The one with the poisoned dagger hidden in the flowers?" "Electra," I said, surprised. "But what? It ends in fire, does it not?" "All great theatre does. This case is not merely a crime, it is a production. And we have only seen the first act." He turned to the doorway. "Now, let us see. who wrote the script. Chapter 5. The Red Herring. Later, that afternoon, as a sullen rain began to drum lightly against the leaded windows of Greystone Grange, Inspector Garrow made good on his threat. With the smug certainty of a man convinced of his own efficiency, he summoned the entire household into the main hall, and, in front of all assembled, placed the valet, Joseph Griggs, under arrest. The poor fellow stood in stunned silence as the manacles were snapped about his wrists. He was scarcely more than 30, with a narrow face, and wore the look of a man who had never in his life imagined his fate would be shaped by bloodstains and suspicion. On what basis? Holmes asked coolly from the stair above. "The glove," Garrow said, holding up the evidence in a paper wrap. "Left behind under the bureau. Blood on the cuff. And he was seen near the study minutes before the murder. More than enough." Holmes descended slowly, hands in his coat pockets. "And what is the blood type?" Garrow blinked. "We haven't had it tested yet." "Then may I presume you are acting on inference rather than proof?" "I'm acting on common sense, Holmes," Garrow growled. "Which is more than I can say for you." Griggs finally found his voice. "I didn't do it, sir. I was never even in the study that night." Holmes turned to him. "You tore your glove? How?" "I caught it on the brass edge of the door to the coat cupboard. I told Inspector Garrow that. And the blood? I cut my hand earlier, sir, in the scullery. There's a ledger. It'll show I signed the injury book." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked into the study, leaving Garrow bristling in his wake. I followed him, and together we stood in the shadow of the empty writing desk. "This entire scene is constructed," Holmes muttered. "Observe, Watson, the placement of the glove, just out of sight, but not too hidden. The blood, too conveniently located. And Griggs, a man of no particular grudge, without access to Sir Felix's will, and no motive beyond a phantom quarrel over wages." I nodded. "Then you believe he's innocent?" Holmes was silent for a moment, then replied, "Watson, when a man is guilty, the facts twist like ivy to wrap around him. But when he is innocent, the facts instead appear arranged, too neat, too presentable, like a stage set left behind." He turned sharply. "Let us speak again to Miss March." We found her in the library, seated beside the fire, a book open but unread in her lap. She looked up as we entered. "You've arrested the valet," she said, her tone unreadable. "Inspector, Garrow has arrested the valet," Holmes corrected. "I have merely observed. Do you disagree with him?" "I do." She watched Holmes over the rim of her teacup. "You think it was someone else in this house?" I think the answer has not yet stepped forward. A flicker passed across her face, but she said nothing. Holmes circled the room slowly, running his hand along the bookshelves. "You told us yesterday that Sir Felix placed the new will in the top left drawer of his desk." "Yes." "And you did not see him remove it again?" "No." Holmes turned. "Miss March, I am going to ask you something rather delicate. Did Sir Felix ever mention why he kept you on as his companion?" Her eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon." "I mean no insult. But Sir Felix was a man of rigid economy. He did not hire sentimentally. And you are not a relative." "No," she said slowly. "He kept me on because I served a purpose." "What purpose?" She hesitated. He trusted me. I was to witness changes to his will, and I was to ensure that if he died unexpectedly, the contents of the latest version would be made known. Then you are familiar with its contents? Yes. Who was named heir? She took a breath. Not Giles Torrington. The Grange was to pass to a trust, managed by the solicitor's firm, with portions to be released gradually for charitable causes. Giles was to receive a modest annuity. And you? Nothing. Holmes regarded her. You're certain? She met his gaze without wavering. Absolutely. There was a pause. Then Holmes turned back toward the door. Thank you, Miss March. One more thing. Did Sir Felix ever speak of someone named O? An initial, perhaps? Or a code name? She stiffened slightly. Why do you ask? He removed the scorched note from his coat pocket. It mentions fire and speaks as if the writer knew a hidden truth. She studied the note. I've seen this handwriting before. Holmes leaned in. Where? In a letter Sir Felix received last month. I delivered it to him myself. He read it, tore it in half, and tossed it into the fire. And the signature, a single letter. Oh, Holmes's eyes sharpened. And you have no idea who this O might be? I don't, but Sir Felix seemed rattled. He ordered all letters henceforth handed to him unopened. Outside, a roll of distant thunder echoed across the Surrey hills. Holmes returned the note to his coat and paced slowly along the carpet. So we have a blackmailer, perhaps. I mused aloud. One who threatened to expose something, or force Sir Felix's hand. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he crouched near the fire grate and reached inside with his gloved hand. He pulled something out and held it up. A small metal fragment, twisted, scorched, and slightly curved. The base of a candle, he said softly, broken off and left behind. So it didn't disappear. It burned or was made to appear so. I leaned closer. Then someone wanted it to seem vanished. Just so, Holmes said, to complete the illusion. He rose slowly. And illusions, Watson, are only necessary when the truth is too dangerous to reveal. Just then, a constable burst into the room. Mr. Holmes, sir, Inspector Garrow says you're to come to the village. They've found something near the train station. Holmes raised a brow. Indeed. Yes, sir. A burnt satchel, and inside it, papers. We exchanged a look. The missing letter, I breathed. Perhaps, Holmes said, or another layer of deceit. He was already reaching for his coat. The red herring, he muttered. Let us see where it swims. Chapter 6. A Hidden Inconsistency. The village of Greyston Hollow lay just over a mile from the Grange, nestled like a forgotten relic in the valley's crook. When we arrived at the station, the rain had ceased, but the earth was thick with mud, and the clouds overhead still hung low, like smoke reluctant to rise. Inspector Garrow awaited us beside a gravel path just off the railway siding. His boots caked in sludge, a tarpaulin-covered parcel at his feet. A constable stood nearby, looking equal parts proud and bewildered. We found it just there, Garrow announced, pointing to a hedgerow by the embankment. Likely tossed from the 8:15 train yesterday morning. Caught on the brambles, Holmes crouched and examined the satchel beneath the tarp. It was made of dark leather, scorched along one side, as though partially burned, and then doused in haste. He lifted it gently and opened the brass clasp. Inside was a half-charred bundle of papers, some damp, some brittle. Holmes sorted them quickly, laying each on a dry spot of gravel. "What do you make of it?" Garrow asked. Holmes did not reply immediately. He was staring at one particular document, one of the few unburned pages, creased but intact. I stepped closer. It was a letter, typed neatly and signed in ink. Felix Torrington. Holmes read it aloud. "To whom it may concern, I, Felix Torrington, being of sound mind, do hereby revoke any previous testamentary documents and declare this my final will and testament. My estate, including Greystone Grange, shall be entrusted to the Torrington Charitable Trust, overseen by Mr. Lionel Rivington of Godwin, Page and Halloway." He stopped, frowning. "No mention of Giles Torrington," I said. "Nor of Adela March," Holmes added. "But that's not what troubles me." He held the page to the light and inspected the signature. "Too clean," he muttered. "Too recent." Garrow raised an eyebrow. "What are you implying?" Holmes turned to him. "This letter was never sealed. There's no wax trace, no envelope. It's as though someone typed and signed it in haste, then attempted to destroy it, but not thoroughly." He picked up another scrap. A torn envelope, also singed. A single initial remained on the front. "O, the mysterious O again," I noted. Holmes nodded, then knelt beside the hedgerow. The satchel was thrown from the train. But why? If someone wished to destroy its contents, they could have burned them entirely. But this was partial, frantic, and at the last moment. "Perhaps they feared being caught with it," I offered. "Indeed, but then why carry it at all?" Holmes stared at the scorched flap of leather. "Because the contents mattered, and perhaps not to the person who discarded it, but to someone else." He rose, his coat flicking damp droplets as he moved. "Garrow, you still have the valet in custody." "In the holding cell back in the village. I want to speak with him. Now." 15 minutes later, we stood inside a chilly, stone-walled constable's office. Griggs sat on a bench behind iron bars, his eyes wide as Holmes approached. "You're not here to accuse me again, are you?" he asked wearily. "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "I am here to ask you a question that may save you." Griggs straightened slightly. "Have you ever seen this?" Holmes produced the remains of the satchel. Griggs frowned. "Yes, that's Sir Felix's. He never left the house with it. It was where he kept private papers." "You're sure?" "Positive. It always sat under the right drawer of his desk. Locked, I think." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Then someone removed it after his death." "Or just before," I added. Holmes turned back to Griggs. "One final question. Did Sir Felix ever receive late-night visitors?" The valet hesitated. "Sometimes, once or twice a month. Always the same gentleman, older, short, dark coat, never gave a name, always came through the back." "Did Miss March or Mr. Torrington know of this?" "I doubt it. Sir Felix was secretive. He only ever let the man into the study, and only when everyone else had retired." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Do you recall when this last occurred?" Griggs nodded. "About 10 days ago. Same man. Stayed nearly an hour. When he left, Sir Felix looked shaken." Holmes turned on his heel. "Thank you, Mr. Griggs. You've been more helpful than you know." As we stepped out into the hall, I looked at him. "You believe this unknown visitor is our blackmailer?" "I believe this man is at the very heart of the case." We returned to Greystone Grange just before dusk. Holmes went immediately to the study, sat cross-legged on the rug beside the writing desk, and withdrew a small box from his coat. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Looking for inconsistencies." He lit a match and held it to a scrap of beeswax. As it melted, he carefully shaped it into a small bead and dripped it onto a scrap of parchment. Then he pressed the broken base of the candle stub we had found into it. The wax cracked immediately. "Too brittle," Holmes muttered. The burn was not natural, it was staged. Someone forced the candle to bend, using heat and pressure, possibly even boiling water. It was no accident. But why? To fake the passage of time, perhaps, or to lure our eyes away from what really mattered. He stood slowly and moved to the bookshelf. "Come here, Watson." I joined him as he pulled back a volume, The Silent Clocks of Antwerp, revealing a thin groove in the wood behind. "Another hidden scrap?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "Something else." He pressed the groove. A faint click. Part of the wall slid open with a soft hiss. Behind it, a narrow recess no more than a foot wide, containing a small wooden compartment, and inside it a second candle, crooked, whole, untouched. "This," Holmes said softly, "is the candle we were meant to find." I stared at the perfectly preserved wax figure, its wick long, its scent distinctly lavender. "But what does it mean?" I whispered. Holmes didn't answer. He simply smiled, thinly, coldly. "It means, my dear Watson, that we are not chasing shadows. We are being led by them." Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. That evening, a brittle chill settled across Greystone Grange, and a heavy hush descended, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The servants moved with subdued caution, and even Inspector Garrow seemed to sense that the case, which had once seemed so straightforward to him, had begun to unravel into something far more sinister. Holmes and I stood once more in Sir Felix's study, the door now closed behind us. On the desk lay the second candle, whole, unused, slightly warped, and yet undeniably a twin to the first. Its scent was unmistakable, lavender and beeswax, delicate but deliberate. Holmes stared at it for several long moments without speaking, then turned abruptly and crossed to the bookcase where the hidden compartment had been revealed. "Watson," he said, "we are now faced with a doubling of the impossible. A murder within a locked room, and now a candle, perfect and untouched, deliberately concealed in a wall that no one was meant to know existed. A candle not used in the crime, but which resembles the one that was? Or was it the same?" "You believe the murderer created a false scene?" I asked. "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "A deception within a deception. The bent candle, the melted wax trail, stagecraft, all of it. Someone wished to mislead us by substituting this candle with a counterpart burned in controlled conditions, and then destroyed. But why preserve the original?" "To keep a trophy?" I offered. Holmes shook his head. "No, I believe it was insurance. The real candle may bear some identifying mark, something the murderer dared not destroy without keeping proof of it intact." A sharp knock broke our thoughts. Mrs. Hapwell entered, her face pale, eyes wide. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you must come at once. There's been another incident." We followed her through the west wing, down a seldom-used corridor that led to the housekeeper's office. There, on the floor outside the linen cupboard, lay a crumpled figure. It was Clara Dimmock, the maid. She was unconscious but alive, a bleeding wound visible at the back of her head. A shattered porcelain pitcher lay beside her, and near it a trail of smeared wax, this time bright white. Holmes crouched beside the girl, examining her pulse. "She's breathing," he said. "Head wound, blunt force, not life-threatening. Watson!" I moved to his side and quickly assessed her. "She's concussed, likely struck from behind. The wound is clean, no splinters. Something smooth, perhaps a handle or vase." Holmes stood and turned to Mrs. Hapwell. "Who found her?" "I did. I came to check the linen stock and saw her on the floor. She had no duties in this wing today." "And to eat this wax?" he asked, pointing. "I've no idea, sir. That's not one of our candles. We use only yellow beeswax." Holmes bent and touched the congealed trail. Soft, recently melted, artificial, paraffin, not beeswax. I stared at him. Another signal. He nodded grimly. "The murderer has grown bold. They strike again, and leave us another cryptic message in wax. We had Clara carried to the servants' quarters and summoned the local doctor to attend to her." Holmes returned to the study, restless, pacing like a caged animal, his mind spinning faster than I could follow. "It's escalation," he said at last. "She knew something, or saw something, and someone. Feared she might speak. Or already had," I said. "She told us about Giles's argument, about Miss March staying upstairs. That could have made her a threat to either." "True," Holmes said, "but I believe there is more. Clara knew the household intimately, its patterns, its passages. She may have seen something no one else would question, and for that she was silenced." Holmes walked to the desk, pulled open the lower drawer, and removed a stack of Sir Felix's. Correspondence, most of it mundane, estate accounts, charity requests, and a series of sternly worded letters addressed to Giles regarding outstanding debts. But then Holmes found something odd. A letter addressed to Sir Felix, dated 3 weeks prior, unsigned, but the paper was unusual. Thick, textured vellum, and bearing a faint scent of cloves. The handwriting was rigid and exacting. Holmes read it aloud. "The past does not burn cleanly, Sir Felix. Some embers remain, even when the fire has gone cold. You may change your legacy, but you cannot unmake your sins. Others remember even if you forget, and others speak even when you are silent." At the bottom, a symbol, not a name, was inked in red. A circle, enclosing a crooked candle. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. Holmes tapped the parchment. A signature of sorts, a warning. And it confirms a suspicion I've long held. This is not merely a murder, Watson. This is retribution. You believe this is connected to some past wrongdoing? Holmes nodded slowly. Sir Felix was a solicitor, a landowner, and a patron of charitable trusts. Men in such positions often carry secrets, decisions that hurt others. I suspect this case is not about inheritance or envy. but justice. Or what someone believes to be justice. At that moment, Inspector Garrow burst into the room, his face red, his breath quick. "Holmes! The maid's recovered consciousness!" Holmes snapped to attention. "Is she able to speak?" "A few words. She asked for you." Within minutes, we were at Clara's bedside. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy but aware. Holmes leaned close. "Clara, it's Mr. Holmes. Can you hear me?" She nodded faintly. "Who struck you?" Her lips moved slowly. "Didn't see. Behind me." Holmes remained calm. "Why were you in the West Wing?" Her fingers curled weakly. "Wanted to tell you. Candle, the one in the drawing room." "Yes," Holmes urged. She exhaled slowly. "Wasn't there before. Moved it. Someone put it back." Holmes froze. "You mean the candle on the mantelpiece? The crooked one?" She gave the faintest nod. "Night. Before, it wasn't there." Then stood. "Watson," he said, his voice tight, "someone is replanting evidence, constructing a narrative piece by piece." I looked at him. "To support the illusion? To maintain it," he said darkly. "And now we know. The illusion is still being built, even as we speak." He turned, coat whipping behind him as he strode for the door. "We are not investigating a murder," he said grimly. "We are participating in a performance." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. That night, long after the house had gone to sleep and the storm clouds thickened once more over the Grange, Holmes did something he rarely did during an active investigation. He asked for complete solitude. He gave me no instructions, offered no explanation, merely instructed that I not follow him past 11 o'clock, and that under no circumstances was anyone to enter the drawing room after midnight. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a fierce clarity I had seen only in those rare moments when his mind had alighted on a path few others could follow. He disappeared shortly thereafter, a dark silhouette vanishing into the eastern corridor with a candle in hand and the crooked wax figure in his pocket. Left alone in the sitting room, I poured myself a measure of brandy and tried to collect my scattered thoughts. The past 3 days had spun out like a dream wrapped inside a riddle, every answer giving way to deeper puzzles. Sir Felix, a man already surrounded by secrets, had been killed in a room no one could enter. A candle had vanished and then returned, replicated or replaced, and a trail of carefully planted wax now marked the Grange like a series of whispered lies. And then, of course, there was O, the unknown letter-writer, the observer, the orchestrator. Holmes had said this was no mere murder, but a performance, and now he was ready to step onto the stage. At 1:45, I heard faint footsteps in the hall. I opened the door, cautiously, and caught sight of Holmes again, this time dressed not in his usual dark suit, but in a faded linen smock, the kind worn by Sir Felix's household when cleaning. His hair was tucked beneath a soft cap, and his hands were gloved. Medium M did not speak. He passed by me as if I were a coat rack, eyes fixed forward, breath steady. He carried a single brass candlestick, the second crooked candle now affixed in it. I watched in bafflement as he entered the study and gently shut the door behind him. Exactly 30 minutes later, a sound echoed through the house, A sharp knock, then another, and then the sudden splintering of wood. I leapt to my feet and raced to the study. The door was ajar. Inside, Holmes was crouched by the hearth, winded but grinning. A wooden shutter from the side wall lay cracked on the floor, and a fine trail of dust hung in the air. Before I could speak, he raised a hand. "Watch," he said. He pointed to the writing desk. There, on the same brass holder where the melted candle had first sat, stood its twin, this time lit. The flame flickered gently, illuminating the warped wax shaft. Holmes stepped away, allowing the room to settle into quiet. Minutes passed. Then, ever so slowly, the candle began to bend, not burn, but lean, not by the whim of melted wax, but by design. Holmes moved to the rug and placed a saucer just beneath the candle's projected arc. Exactly 4 minutes later, the first bead of wax fell, landing precisely in the centre of the dish. Another minute passed, then another. The wax continued its descent, but always in a straight line, falling exactly where Holmes intended. When he extinguished the flame, the trail it had left mirrored the one from the night of the murder, down to its angle and rhythm. Was stunned. "You built the crime," I breathed. Holmes smiled. "Reconstructed it. It is quite something, Watson, to perform an illusion backward." "But how?" He held up a small metallic rod, bent at the centre. "A heat-reactive insert," he said. "This was embedded inside the candle, undetectable to the eye. When lit, the rod gradually bends under heat, causing the candle itself to lean without collapsing. It controls the direction of the melt." He tapped the wax trail. "That's why the first candle burned crooked. Not by accident, but by design. It was a timepiece of sorts, a theatrical flourish. The killer wanted us to look here and draw false conclusions about when the death occurred. So the time of death was likely hours earlier. Sir Felix may have already been dead when the candle was lit. The locked room wasn't a puzzle. It was a set, and the killer was its playwright. My mind reeled. But Holmes, if they set the scene, planted, the wax arranged the door, even timed the trail, why leave the second candle hidden in the wall? Holmes looked at me carefully. "That, Watson, is the one part I don't yet understand. My suspicion is that they feared discovery, that the real candle, if found and examined, would give away the trick. So they hid it, perhaps to recover it later." I paced, running a hand through my hair. "And Clara?" "She saw someone moving the candles. That made her dangerous. So she was attacked, not killed, mind you, but silenced." Holmes moved toward the desk again, and knelt. "There is one final inconsistency." He opened the lower drawer and retrieved a thin black envelope tucked beneath the ledger book. It was sealed with wax, the same crimson circle enclosing a crooked candle. He opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, faded and cracked with age. It showed a younger Sir Felix, standing with 3 others in front of a building marked St. Ignatius Home for Foundlings. I leaned over his shoulder. "Who are they?" I asked. Holmes pointed to a name scrawled on the back. One of the figures was labelled Osmond, another F.T. Felix Torrington. Holmes stood holding the photograph like a relic. "The truth, Watson. he said softly, is not buried in the year present. It's hiding in the past. We turned as footsteps echoed again in the corridor. A knock, then Mrs. Hapwell's voice, thin and tight. "Mr. Holmes, there's someone at the door. He says he's come to settle a debt. Says his name is Osmond." Holmes turned slowly. The final act was about to begin. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The man who entered Greystone Grange under the name Osmond did not match the image I had conjured in my mind. He was neither wild-eyed nor ragged, but impeccably dressed. An older gentleman of modest height, with silver-threaded hair and a trimmed beard. His coat was damp from the mist, but his bearing was assured, even graceful, as though he carried with him not the weight of accusation, but the satisfaction of inevitability. He introduced himself with a calm bow. "Victor Osmond, I believe Mr. Holmes is expecting me." Holmes offered no greeting, only a gesture to the drawing-room, where the remains of our reconstruction still lay. Wax droplets, saucer, scorched candle-holder. "An elaborate game," Osmond said, eyeing the scene. "Almost poetic." Holmes studied him in silence. I could feel the air in the room stretched tight, like a wire between the two men. "You knew Sir Felix?" Holmes said at last. Osmond nodded. "We were boys together, at St. Ignatius, then later men with shared histories." "Yet you were not in his will, nor mentioned in his papers. Why?" "Because some names, Mr. Holmes, are meant to be forgotten, and others erased. You threatened him." I reminded him. Holmes tilted his head. "Of what?" Osmond's expression did not shift. "Of the truth, that Sir Felix's success was built on ashes." Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes gestured to the envelope containing the photograph. This was found in a hidden compartment. Why conceal it? Osmond smiled faintly. "Because it's a portrait of guilt. Look closer." We did. Holmes held the photo under the lamp's glow. 4 boys, 1 orphanage, and in the background, a small boy in shadows behind the others unnamed. Osmond pointed to him. He was one of us. They called him Peter Finch. Frail, curious, and very clever. Holmes frowned. And he disappeared. No one ever investigated. Sir Felix made it vanish. Convinced the matron it was nothing. We knew the truth. He'd found out about the ledger. What ledger? The one that tracked the donations meant for the children. Money never spent. Stolen, diverted by Torrington's uncle, and later by Felix himself. It went on for years. Holmes grew still. And you confronted him. Last month, I told him I wanted the truth made public, that he should amend his will, not to punish him, but to make restitution. You blackmailed him. I made an offer. Either he come clean, or I would. Which did he choose? Osmond's eyes were distant now. He said he would consider it. Then, 3 days later, he was dead. Holmes studied him carefully. You were in the house the week before the murder. Yes, he invited me. I came under the name Victor Owler. I did not expect to be welcomed. And the candle? The letters signed O? I left them, but I did not kill him, Mr. Holmes. Where were you the night he died? At the Pilgrim's Rest Inn, a mile east of the Hollow. They'll confirm it. I stayed 2 nights. Holmes nodded once, then turned away. You may stay in the village, Tonight, Mr. Osmond. I will find you if I need more." Osmond inclined his head. "You will. I have no doubt." Once he was gone, I said, "You believe him?" "Mostly," Holmes replied. "He was angry, but not reckless, and not theatrical. This murder was both." He walked to the desk again, staring at the candle stub. "I believe Osmond pressed Sir Felix. I believe he intended to force his hand. But I do not believe he slit his throat, arranged wax, and staged a puzzle only a dramatist could invent. Think someone else intercepted their plan?" Holmes nodded. "Someone with more to lose. Someone who feared the truth, not for justice, but for what it would destroy." We sat in silence for some time. Then came a sudden commotion from the corridor, a crash, shouting, then fire. We raced down the hall to the drawing-room, where smoke billowed through the open door. The hearth was ablaze, not with logs, but with papers, torn sheaves burning furiously. Holmes doused them with water from the scuttle, coughing. Garrow appeared seconds later, red-faced. "What happened?" "He barked." Holmes pointed to the remnants of the fire. "Someone tried to destroy documents. Again." From the ashes he retrieved a curled scrap, just enough to read the final line. "A revision of Clause 3, naming Miss Adela March as executor of The Rest Was Gone." We stood, stunned. "She was in the will," I said. "And she lied. About it," Holmes finished. Garrow's face darkened. "You think she set the fire?" "She's one possibility," Holmes said grimly. "But the timing suggests panic." We returned to the corridor. The house was still, but a strange tension now gripped it, like a breath drawn and held. Holmes went straight to Miss March's chamber. The door was ajar, the bed unmade, the window open, and the room empty. "She's fled," I said. Holmes turned slowly, or someone made her vanish. He moved to the writing desk in her room. There, resting atop a folded handkerchief, was something chilling. A single white candle, crooked and unlit. It was identical in shape to the others, but this one bore something new. Along its base, carved in the wax, were the initials. F.T. Holmes stared at it in silence. Then, in a low voice, said, "The performance isn't over." He turned toward me with a glint of cold fire in his eyes. "It has only changed acts." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The morning after Adela March's disappearance dawned with bleak grey skies, and the kind of wind that clawed at the shutters like fingers seeking entry. It was as though Greystone Grange had been placed under siege by the elements themselves, echoing the tension that had settled upon its rooms. Holmes had slept little. He paced the corridor from midnight till dawn, stopping now and then to peer out windows or to scrawl notes in his worn leather pocketbook. I watched him through red-rimmed eyes, unsure if his silence was frustration or the quiet of a mind reaching the edges of revelation. "She ran," Inspector Garrow insisted for the third time that morning. "That's as clear a sign of guilt as any. She lit the fire, she planted the candles, she killed him." "She ran, yes," Holmes said calmly. "But whether it was from guilt or fear remains to be seen." Garrow bristled. "You're defending her!" Holmes turned sharply. "I'm examining all possibilities. A distinction, I'm afraid, you and I must always disagree upon." He turned back to the white candle they had found in her room. "Stidw, bun carved with F.T. Watson," Holmes murmured. "Do you recall what Miss March said to us on the first day?" "She claimed she had no claim in the will," I said, "and yet she was executor. That is no minor detail. She did not merely witness the changes to the will, she was entrusted to carry them out. And yet she burned the document." Holmes shook his head. "That's the inconsistency. The pages in the drawing-room fire weren't just the will. They were ledgers, records, charity statements. Some had nothing to do with the inheritance. It wasn't a calculated erasure. It was desperation. Then someone else started the fire. Someone who feared discovery, not accusation." Garrow scoffed. "And now the lady's vanished, and your witness is gone." "She's not gone," Holmes said quietly. "She's hidden." The inspector blinked. "You think someone took her?" "I think someone lured her out. Miss March was calm, controlled, too controlled. But Clara Dimmock's attack changed something. She realized someone was rewriting the narrative of Sir Felix's death, and that they would not stop until every inconvenient voice had been silenced." Chai stood abruptly. "Come, we are going to the chapel." "The what?" I asked, startled. "The old stone chapel on the eastern edge of the property. Sir Felix visited it weekly. Alone, we followed him across the windswept grounds, past hedgerows and skeletal trees. The chapel was a squat relic of the 18th century, weather-stained, half-covered in moss, and long disused." Holmes pushed the heavy oak door open. The interior was as bleak as the exterior. Dust-coated pews, a cracked altar, and tall stained-glass windows, dulled by age. But on the far wall, below the eastern rose window, sat a confessional booth. Holmes approached it slowly. Inside, hunched and pale, sat Adela March. She did not look up, Miss March. Holmes said softly, "We're not here to harm you," finally raised her eyes. They were sunken, rimmed in shadow. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. Holmes nodded. "But you lied. About the will. About the candle. Why?" "I was trying to protect him." "From what?" She looked away. "From himself." There was a silence. Then, almost mechanically, she began to speak. "Sir Felix wasn't a kind man, but he carried a private burden. Guilt, I think, for what had happened at St. Ignatius. He never admitted it aloud, but I saw it in his letters. The donations he made, the trust he was building. It was all an attempt at reparation." "Osmond, demanded he do more?" Holmes said. She nodded. "He did, and Sir Felix agreed in the end. He made me executor to see it through. Then why run?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I found out someone had forged a second version of the will. A false one. One that left everything to Giles." Holmes tensed. "Do you have it?" She reached into her coat and handed him a folded page, crumpled but intact. Holmes read it carefully, then compared it with the scorched fragment from the fire. "The signatures differ slightly," he said. "The forged version uses a fuller loop on the F." "It was planted," she said, "after Sir Felix was already dead, to mislead investigators." "Who forged it?" She looked at him directly now. "I believe it was Giles, but I couldn't prove it." And then the candle appeared on my desk. The one with the initials? Yes, I'd never seen it before. I took it as a warning. Holmes paced slowly. "We are being presented with an increasingly strange equation," he said. "Giles stood to gain by the old will, but not the revised one. He may have forged a version to replace it. That would explain motive." He turned to Miss March. "But the murder, the locked door, the candle, those were not the actions of a forger. They were the work of someone far more deliberate." Adela frowned. "Then who?" "I don't yet know," Holmes admitted, "but the original will named you as executor. You would have been the one to submit it, and Giles couldn't allow that. He tried to frighten me. Into silence, or into flight," I added. "But there's something else," Holmes said suddenly. "You claimed Sir Felix kept the original will in the left drawer of his desk." "Yes." "It was not found there." "No," she said, frowning. "He told me he had moved it for safety." "To where?" She closed her eyes, thinking. "Then he said, 'Where the light bends and no flame burns.'" Holmes froze. A beat passed. Then his eyes widened. "Of course," he whispered. "Watson, the reading room." "The what?" "Come, without." Another word. We raced back across the grounds and into the Grange. Holmes led us down a corridor I had never entered before, to a small chamber lined with shelves and high, narrow windows of stained glass. He moved to the desk at the centre. "Where the light bends," he muttered, "and no flame burns." He reached beneath the windowsill and pressed. A panel shifted. Inside was a compartment, and within it an envelope, sealed. Holmes opened it reverently. Inside, the original will, signed, sealed, undeniable. "It was never destroyed," he said. "It was hidden." He stood slowly, a smile creeping across his face, satisfaction laced with grim understanding. "We have the truth," he said. "But now," he added, "we must catch the one who tried to bury it." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes is grand. Strategy. It was well past midday when Holmes and I returned to Greystone Grange with the original will secured in a leather folio beneath his arm. He had wrapped it with meticulous care and handed it to me as though it were a fragile relic from antiquity. Adela March followed close behind, her eyes wary but steadier now, her presence no longer that of a hunted woman. "I'm surprised you're not marching straight to Inspector Garrow," I remarked as we crossed the threshold. Holmes gave a slight smile. "The inspector would lock up the first man who twitches. No, this requires finesse, not cuffs. We are not yet done." He turned into the study and set the folio on the desk. The wax trail from days ago was still there, its glistening arc catching the slanting afternoon sun. Holmes stood over it silently, then rang for Mrs. Hapwell. "Tea for 3, he said briskly, "and have Mr. Giles Torrington summoned to the drawing-room in 1 hour. Tell him Miss March has returned, and has something important to share." The housekeeper raised a brow, but did not argue. When we were alone, Holmes turned to Adela. "Come," he said. "Pride will drag him through that door, but he must believe he still has the upper hand." "You want me to lie to him?" she asked, tense. "Not a lie, merely a delay. He must believe that you intend to submit the forged will, not the real one, and that you are doing so reluctantly," she exhaled. "You are placing a great deal of trust in a woman who's misled you before." "I am placing trust," Holmes replied, "in someone who has more to lose from the truth being buried than revealed." He reached for the carved candle, the one with Sir Felix's initials etched at its base. "This," he said, "was meant to terrify, but it's now the perfect instrument for provocation." He explained his plan with swift efficiency. At precisely 5 o'clock, we were all assembled in the drawing-room. Adela March sat near the fireplace, the leather folio upon her lap. I remained at her side, while Holmes took his usual spot near the window, arms folded, face unreadable. Giles Torrington entered with his usual swagger, though it was tinged with impatience. "You sent for me," he said, gaze flicking from Holmes to Adela to the folio. "Rather theatrical, isn't it? We thought you'd appreciate the irony," Holmes replied dryly. Giles smirked. "So, Adela, have you come to hand me the keys to the Grange after all?" "I've come," she said evenly, "to tell you that I intend to honour Sir Felix's final wishes. His will must be respected." His eyes narrowed. "And which will would that be?" "The one I found," she said softly, placing her hand on the folio. "It names me executor. You'll receive your inheritance, Giles, though not as you imagined." He glanced at the document, then at her. "And where did this miraculous rediscovery take place?" "In the reading room, hidden in a wall panel." His lips thinned. "I see," he said. "A secret cache. Very convenient." He took a step closer. "Mind if I see it?" Holmes finally stirred. In time. There was a pause, thick, electric. Then Holmes lifted the candle from the mantelpiece and held it out. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Giles's eyes flicked to the candle. "Should I?" "This one bears Sir Felix's initials. It was found in Miss March's room, after she fled, perhaps placed there as a warning." Giles shrugged. "Sounds like more of your riddles, Holmes." Holmes studied him a moment longer. "And yet, there's something about this candle that troubles me. It's the third of its kind, you see. One burned crooked. One was hidden, and this one untouched, as though waiting." He stepped closer. "Tell me, Mr. Torrington, have you ever handled waxwork?" Giles blinked. "Of course not. Why would I?" "No reason, just that these candles were custom-made. Lavender scent. Beeswax blended with a rare oil found in only one supplier's stock, in Covent Garden, a shop where you, according to their records, purchased 6 such candles 3 weeks ago." Giles's jaw tightened. "That's absurd." Holmes pulled a folded receipt from his coat. "Signed G.T. A gentleman with your likeness, pale coat, cane, slight limp, who claimed he was preparing a rehearsal dinner." "You're lying." "No," Holmes said calmly. "I'm provoking." And just then there came a knock at the door. A constable entered with a small parcel. "Delivery, sir." From the station, Holmes opened it in full view. Inside, a wax seal stamp, a circle enclosing a crooked candle. Giles staggered back half a step. "I've never seen that before," he said, voice rising. "It was recovered from your flat in London," Holmes said, "and after a search this morning, along with 2 more forged drafts of your uncle's will." "Search?" he shouted. "You've no right." "Inspector Garrow did," Holmes replied coldly. "While we lured you here, Your lies were unravelling." Giles lunged for the folio, but Holmes intercepted him with swift precision. In moments the constable had him pinned. He struggled, breath ragged. "You don't understand," he growled. "He deserved it. He ruined everything. My father, my inheritance. He tried to give it all away to strangers." Holmes regarded him grimly. "You couldn't forge your way back into favour, so you tried something bolder." "You staged the murder," I said. "Lit the candle with the bent core, locked the door behind you, let the wax fall to suggest a false time of death. You killed him earlier," Holmes continued, "with a single blade to the throat, silent, surgical. Then you dressed the scene with precision. But you made one mistake," I added. "You kept the real candle, and you left it behind." Holmes nodded. "The illusion was too perfect, Mr. Torrington. You forgot that real life is seldom so tidy." Giles fell silent, deflated. The constable marched him away. The room was left in stunned quiet. Adela March stood slowly and opened the folio. She withdrew the will and held it to the light. "For justice," she said quietly. Holmes gave a faint nod. "No," he said. "For truth." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The storm that had loomed for days finally broke that evening. Rain lashed against the mullioned windows of Greystone Grange in furious sheets, and thunder rolled across the sky with a force that seemed to shake the ancient walls. Within the study, however, there was only the low crackle of the hearth and the subdued silence that always followed the culmination of a crime, when the curtain falls and the audience waits for the meaning behind the spectacle. Giles Torrington had been removed under escort to the village jail. Inspector Garrow, though begrudging in his manner, had offered Holmes a stiff handshake and mumbled acknowledgment of his peculiar but effective methods. Holmes, as usual, had received the praise without expression, but I could sense something unresolved. Holmes sat alone now at the desk of the late Sir Felix, gazing at the leather-bound will which lay once again upon the blotter. He had not spoken in several minutes, his fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, though I knew him well enough to understand that silence did not mean rest. "You've caught him," I said gently, breaking the quiet. Giles Torrington was the architect of the deception. The forgery, the wax, the scene, it all fits. Holmes didn't answer. "Holmes?" He looked up slowly. "You believe the matter resolved, Watson?" I nodded. "As you said yourself, real life is rarely tidy. But in this case, the plan was almost too perfect. The crooked candle, the misdirection. It was theatre. And Giles was the playwright." Holmes rose from his chair and walked to the cold fireplace where the last coals of the evening smouldered. "Yes, Giles orchestrated much, but not everything." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned back, and his eyes had that peculiar brightness I had come to associate with the arrival of revelation. The candle was his. The forgery was his. Even the timing of the scene was his design. But there was one element he could not control. I frowned. "The will?" "No. The second candle." I blinked. "The one hidden in the wall?" "Precisely," Holmes said, stepping closer. "Tell me, Watson, why would a man go to such lengths to create a false time of death, stage the scene meticulously, and then hide the real candle instead of destroying it. Because he was afraid it would betray the trick. Exactly. But if so, why not burn it? Why keep it at all? I shook my head. A sentimental token. Holmes gave me a wry smile. Giles Torrington is many things. Sentimental is not one of them. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheet. The charred remains of a letter, retrieved from the fire 2 nights before. You remember this? He asked. Yes. The fragment from the fireplace, a draft of the will. Not quite, Holmes said. I asked Garrow's men to sift through the ashes again. This was overlooked, a single corner of a separate page. He handed it to me. Scorched and barely legible, the text bore just enough to piece together a line. If you are reading this, then I am already gone. There is one among them who... I looked up sharply. A letter of confession? Or warning, Holmes said. Sir Felix knew something, or someone, and he feared they would strike. I felt a chill begin to creep into my spine. Then you believe someone else was involved? Holmes stepped to the mantel and retrieved the final candle, the one left in Adela March's room. The initials FT still glistened faintly at its base. Miss March believed it was meant to frighten her, he said, but I believe it was a message from someone else entirely. He placed the candle beside the others on the desk. This was not planted by Giles. His methods were cruder, effective, yes, but lacking subtlety. This is elegant, intimate. I was quiet a moment. Then who? Holmes met my gaze. Adela March, I blinked. Holmes, that's impossible. She was the one being pursued. She hid from Giles. She brought us the truth. She brought us a truth, Holmes said softly. But not all of it. He began to pace. She knew about Giles's forgery. That much is certain. She had motive to protect Sir Felix's real will. But she also had something Giles did not. Proximity. Knowledge of the house's layout. Its secrets. But she was the executor of the will, I argued. Why would she risk destroying it? Preserve her own version of justice, Holmes said. I believe she saw herself as the moral heir to Sir Felix. And when he refused to fully confess, when he chose silence over public admission, she took it upon herself to force the truth into light. My breath caught. You mean... She didn't just uncover Giles's plot. She used it. Holmes nodded slowly. She allowed Giles to set the stage, and then she added her own flourish. The hidden candle, the note, the trail of wax in her room. She let us believe she was the next target, when in truth she was shaping the ending to her liking. He paused. And if I'm correct, Watson, then she also wrote the first letter we found, the one signed only O. But that was Osmond's symbol, I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. No, that was her symbol. Osmond told us about Peter Finch, the boy who vanished from St. Ignatius. But there was another boy in that photo, the unnamed child in the shadows. He opened the photograph once more, which we had retrieved from the hidden compartment. He studied the handwriting on the envelope from O, and compared it with Adela's address to the solicitor. Similar slant, same sharp tail on the letter R. She was that child, not just a witness to Sir Felix's sins, a victim of them. I could hardly speak. She used the candle, Holmes said, not as a weapon, but as a symbol, of what had been done, of what had been taken. The crooked light, the bent truth. We stood in silence. "She didn't kill him," Holmes said at last, "but she knew Giles would. She just didn't stop it." "And now?" I asked. Holmes's face was unreadable. "Now we let justice take the form it will. Giles will hang. Adela March will vanish. She won't return to London. She'll disappear into the world. And perhaps for her, that's justice enough." He extinguished the last candle on the desk. The flame died with a faint hiss, and the room dimmed. Holmes turned away, his voice barely above a whisper. Even in truth, there are shadows. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The rain persisted into the next day, sweeping over Greystone Grange with a ceaseless rhythm that seemed to wash away the last remnants of pretense. The house felt different now, emptier, as though the secrets it once held had been coaxed into the open and had fled into the storm. Holmes had retired early that morning to the small reading room, the very place where the original will had been found. He sat not at the desk this time, but by the narrow stained-glass window, watching the sky through panes dulled by age. His violin rested beside him, untouched. Even to me, it was clear he was wrestling with something beyond deduction, something personal. I had just returned from the village, where I had checked in with Inspector Garrow regarding Giles Torrington's status. Giles remained behind bars, unrepentant and silent, refusing all questions save one. He had asked whether Adela March had truly returned to the Grange, or if she had only appeared in order to bait him. Holmes had, of course, anticipated that question. When I shared this with him, Holmes only murmured, "Even the guilty are sometimes capable of the right insight." But what neither of us anticipated was what came later that evening. It was nearly 6 when a telegram arrived, hurried up the hill from the Greystone telegraph office. The butler delivered it with trembling hands, clearly rattled. Holmes took it, read it once, and stood abruptly. I read over his shoulder. "Urgent stop Miss Adela March located at Waterloo Station boarding Paris Express. Stop travelling under name. ADA Morton. Stop local agent followed until lost in crowd. Stop Scotland Yard." Holmes folded the paper with precision. "She's running," I said. "She's not simply running," Holmes replied. "She's vanishing, and she's doing it in the only way she knows, quietly, without violence, without glory." I frowned. "You suspected she might leave." "I did." "I left the window open, Watson." I blinked. "You let her go?" "She needed to go," said. "Justice, in this case, is not a rope or a prison." "But surely she should answer for—" "For what?" Holmes interrupted softly. "For surviving a wound too old for courts to acknowledge? For letting the guilty destroy each other? She committed no murder, but she ended the performance." I had no response. Holmes turned toward the hearth, where a fresh fire crackled. He reached into his coat and pulled out the last item he had retrieved from Adela's quarters before she fled. A second envelope, sealed with red wax. It bore no name, but the seal was unmistakable. The same crooked candle within a circle. He broke the seal and unfolded the page within. "Mr. Holmes, thank you, not for absolution nor protection, but for understanding. The truth was never hidden. It was simply not heard. Men like Sir Felix made careers of silencing others. And Giles? He wanted the stage, but not the script. I never set out to deceive you, only to ensure that this time the story would be told in full. Do not look for me. You once told Watson that the world is full of obvious things which nobody ever observes. He was one of them. A.M. Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me without a word. I read it in silence, each line sinking deeper than the last. Outside, the storm began to break at last. The wind eased, and a shaft of pale light filtered through the window, casting its glow over the desk, the candle stubs, the charred paper remnants, and the photograph of 4 forgotten children from St. Ignatius. Holmes picked up the photograph and studied it once more. It was never about inheritance, he said quietly. Not really. It was about memory, about forcing the world to see what it had chosen to forget. We sat for a long time, neither speaking, the fire hissing softly beside us. Then, without a word, Holmes stood, took the remaining candle, the one that had never been lit, and carried it to the hearth. He held it there for a moment, then let it fall. The wax melted slowly, curling like the final line of a letter that no one would ever answer. She chose her ending, he said, turning away, and we must respect it. Later that night, as we prepared to leave the Grange, Holmes paused at the top of the staircase, gazing down the corridor towards Sir Felix's study. A locked room, he said softly, a crooked candle, a missing will, and 4 names buried beneath 30 years of dust. He turned to me. Watson, do you know why magic works? I shook my head. Because people want to be deceived. They crave the illusion more than the truth. And in this case, the greatest illusion of all was that justice and truth are always the same. We left Greystone Grange behind us as the storm clouds parted, but some shadows, I knew, would follow us far beyond the hills of Surrey. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. It was several days later, back in the familiar surrounds of 221B Baker Street, that Holmes finally sat down to commit his thoughts to order. The rain-washed cobbles of London below our window were slick with sleet, and the fire in our sitting room burned briskly, casting orange flickers across the Persian carpet. The events at Greystone Grange had left their mark on us both, though, as always, Holmes bore his with a curious detachment, while I remained quietly haunted by Adela March's final words. "I keep turning it over," I said, breaking our contemplative silence. "The will, the candle, the final letter. What piece, Holmes, did you not reveal to Garrow?" He looked up from his chair, his eyes catching mine. "The most important one," he said simply. I leaned forward. "Then what was it?" Holmes stood and retrieved from the mantel the broken wax seal we had recovered from Adela's last letter. He held it between thumb and forefinger, angling it toward the lamplight. "You remember this symbol?" he said. "The crooked candle in a ring. Of course, the same emblem that appeared on the threatening notes to Sir Felix." "Exactly. And therein lies the question. Why a candle?" I shrugged. "A symbol of truth, perhaps. Light in darkness." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But also fragility. Time. Wax melts. Fire consumes. The candle is the perfect metaphor for secrets. Once lit, it burns toward its own destruction. He crossed to the desk and opened a folio, laying out a final scrap of paper, one I hadn't seen before. "This," he said, "was delivered to Scotland Yard anonymously this morning." I examined it. The handwriting was sparse, the strokes erratic. It read, "He took everything from us, the children, the money, the names. But the truth melts through even stone. Let the candle show you what he tried to hide. In the place where fire never touched it, Holmes let the silence settle." "It's a confession," I said. "A fragment of one," he replied. "And more importantly, a riddle." I puzzled through it again. The place where fire never touched it. "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "You recall the forgery Giles made? The will he attempted to pass off as the original? He destroyed it in the drawing-room fire, but one corner survived, barely scorched. And in that corner, an odd stain. Not ink, not ash." He produced it from a slipcase and handed it to me. Under the glass, I saw it. A faint grey smudge near the edge of the parchment. Holmes handed me a small vial of chemical reagent. "Brush this across the mark," he instructed. I did so carefully. The stain shifted, darkened, then revealed itself. Letters. Faint, but legible. Cavendish Hall, 1889. I looked up. "That's not Greystone." "No," Holmes said. "It's an estate near Cambridge, now long abandoned, but once owned by Felix Torrington's older brother, Archibald, who died under curious circumstances." My mind began to spin. "Ah, you saying there was another crime?" Holmes sat once more. "I'm saying the roots of this one stretch back further than any of us guessed. Sir Felix was not merely hiding a financial scandal at St. Ignatius. He was concealing something more personal, something tied to Cavendish Hall." He rose again and paced slowly. "There's a rumour, Watson, whispered among solicitors, never confirmed, that Archibald Torrington died in a fire, but not one caused by accident. The blaze supposedly consumed half the hall, but the body was never positively identified. Sir Felix claimed to have arrived too late to save him, and shortly thereafter he inherited all holdings." I felt a chill. "Are you suggesting Sir Felix may have killed his brother?" Holmes said softly. "Perhaps, or allowed him to die, which in some eyes amounts to the same." He turned sharply. "And that, Watson, is the final clue." I stared at him. "Don't you see? The candle was never just about the night of his death. It was a motif, a constant. Every decade, every place touched by Sir Felix's ambitions ended in fire. Cavendish Hall, St. Ignatius, the Grange. The fires were meant to erase. But the candle survived. And Adela knew this. She remembered it, Holmes said. She saw what others missed. That every time Sir Felix was confronted with consequence, a fire followed. But fire cannot burn everything. Some wax resists, some truth endures. He tapped the wax seal. That's why she used the candle. That's why she chose to haunt the crime with it. Because it was his symbol and hers. There was a long pause. "Then," I said, "you still haven't answered the question." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you tell Garrow all this?" He sighed and lowered himself into his armchair. "Because what remains are shadows, Watson. Ghosts. We can try to grasp them, name them, accuse them, but there will never be evidence enough. The law is ill-suited to subtleties. Garrow has Giles Torrington, a man who committed forgery, staged a crime scene, and, by all accounts, murdered his uncle for inheritance. But Adela is gone, Holmes said quietly, and the world will not look for her. He turned to the window, where the last of the evening light was fading beyond the rooftops of Baker Street. In another life, he said, she might have been a writer or a scholar. Instead, she became a keeper of memory, a curator of flame. I did not press him further. Some truths I knew Holmes kept for himself, and some candles burned too slowly for justice to see. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. A week later, at Holmes's request, we returned once more to Greystone Grange, though the fire had been swept from the hearths, and the rain had finally given way to a biting but clear sky. The house retained its peculiar gravity, as if the weight of truth still lingered in its corridors. The staff had begun returning to their normal routines, though the butler, Mr. Needham, now walked with a slight tremor in his step and avoided the study as though it were cursed ground. Inspector Garrow arrived shortly after us, his boots mud-caked from the journey and his temper already smouldering. "I thought the case was closed, Holmes," he said without greeting. "Giles Torrington is remanded for trial. The Crown has what it needs." Holmes was characteristically unreadable. The Crown has a culprit, yes, but whether it has the truth is another matter. Garrow scoffed. "Your truths tend to come without witnesses, without evidence, just riddles and candles." "And yet," Holmes said, "they always come." Before Garrow could protest further, Holmes turned and beckoned him into the grand drawing-room, where a fire now crackled warmly, and a table had been set, not for a meal, but for confrontation. One by one, Holmes had arranged the final act. Lionel Rivington, the nervous solicitor, was seated nearest the hearth, fiddling with his cufflinks. Mrs. Hapwell, the housekeeper, stood stiffly by the door, her lips pursed so tightly they had nearly vanished. Victor Osmond, summoned again from the village, had arrived only minutes before, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor as he entered, his face as composed as a monument. Garrow took a chair with visible reluctance. Holmes stood. "This," he said, calmly, "is the last time we shall gather within these walls under the shadow of Sir Felix Torrington. Before we close the book entirely, I must ask each of you to bear witness to what follows." He turned to me. "Watson, if you please." I rose and opened a leather folder I had carried from Baker Street. From it I withdrew the original will, clean, sealed, and witnessed. Then I laid it upon the table. "The true will," Holmes announced, "recovered from a hidden panel within the reading-room. Valid, undeniable. It names Miss Adela March as executor and places the Torrington estate into charitable trust." Holmes let that settle. Sir Felix died believing this would define his legacy. Rivington cleared his throat. "Then why the forgery? Why not simply burn this one and replace it?" "Because Giles Torrington lacked time," Holmes said, "and courage. He forged the second will quickly, sloppily. He never found the original. Adela March did." Mrs. Hapwell shifted, and she ran, just like a guilty woman. Holmes turned to her. She did not run from justice. She ran from what justice could not protect her from. I do not expect everyone in this room to understand that." Osmond spoke for the first time. "You said we were here to bear witness, Mr. Holmes. But witness to what?" "To the final piece," Holmes said. He moved to the mantel and retrieved the candle, not one of the originals, a new one. "This," he said, "was poured by my instruction, using the very mould Giles purchased in Covent Garden. Its twin was planted in Adela's room to frighten her, or so we thought." He held the candle toward the firelight. "But this candle carries something the others did not." He scraped gently at its base. From beneath the layer of wax, a copper sliver emerged. Holmes held it up. "A key," he said. "Specifically, the key to Sir Felix's private safe. One Giles claimed he never located, and which, interestingly, contained no money, but letters." He turned to Rivington. "Letters your firm held for decades. Correspondence between Sir Felix and a number of shell organisations tied to properties across England, including Cavendish Hall." Garrow blinked. "The burned estate?" "Yes," Holmes said. "And in those letters lies the final story. Cavendish Hall did not burn accidentally, nor did Sir Felix merely inherit the estate." Osmond's voice cut the air. "He arranged it?" Holmes turned to him gently. "No, but he let it happen. His brother Archibald had discovered Felix's embezzlements from early charitable endowments. A confrontation occurred. Violence followed. The fire may have been started in panic, but Sir Felix did not attempt to stop it. He walked away." Rivington looked pale. Why hide all this? Why leave clues?" Holmes tapped the candle base again. "Because Sir Felix changed in his final years, or perhaps he always feared being exposed. Either way, he buried his sins in symbols. The candle, the letters, the locked compartment. He wanted someone to find them, just not too soon." Mrs. Hapwell exhaled sharply. "And Miss March?" Holmes paused. She was that someone. He looked at each of them in turn. She uncovered what no one else could see. She watched Giles forge a will, watched justice fail to see past surface guilt, and she chose not to strike, but to illuminate. Garrow leaned forward. "But she vanished." Holmes nodded. "Yes, she wrote to me before she left. Her letter was not a confession. It was a farewell, and a request that we not forget." Laid the letter on the table beside the will. Silence filled the room. For once, even Garrow had no rebuttal. Holmes straightened. "There will be no further arrests, no more trials. Giles Torrington will answer for the murder. The estate will pass into the trust, and the past will remain exactly where it belongs." He turned to Osmond. "You, perhaps more than anyone, understand why some truths must be remembered, but not repeated." Osmond said nothing, but the look in his eyes was all the answer needed. Holmes walked slowly to the door. "As I said," he murmured, "the candle burns only so long." He glanced once more at the hearth. "And this one has reached its end." Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime back in the snug embrace of 221B Baker Street, with the sleet now replaced by a brittle, late-winter sun. Holmes took to his desk with the gravity of a judge ready to pronounce sentence. Not upon a man, but upon a labyrinth of events. He had not yet recorded the case in full, and I, sensing that the storm had finally passed, pressed him that afternoon. "You owe it to posterity, Holmes," I said. "The crooked candle, the false will, the locked room illusion. It's your most intricate case yet." Holmes looked up from his teacup, fingers resting on his temple. "Perhaps," he said mildly. "But complexity does not always equal brilliance. Often it's merely the result of desperation masquerading as cleverness." Still, he reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to speak. "Let us consider the matter from the beginning, Watson. Sir Felix Torrington was not merely an old man with a barbed tongue and a tidy fortune. He was a man living on the precipice of secrets too vast to carry quietly. His wealth had been drawn, in part, from misappropriated charitable funds, most notably from the St. Ignatius Home for Dichieux foundlings. That much we confirmed through Osmond and the ledger." He lifted one of his notes, reading aloud. "Felix's involvement in the collapse of multiple endowments led to at least 2 known cover-ups, including the disappearance of a young boy believed to have discovered the financial discrepancies." "The boy Osmond mentioned?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Peter Finch. Though his body was never found, his absence formed the core of Osmond's private vendetta. But here's where it grows twisted. Felix's guilt, never publicly acknowledged, was not unknown to others, especially not to Miss Adela March." He poured another cup of tea and continued. "She was the key. A companion, yes, but also a quiet observer of Felix's moods, his contradictions. I believe she recognized that he was not the man he pretended to be, and at some point she gained access to the records he had kept hidden, the original will, the letters from Cavendish Hall, perhaps even the photograph we later found. But she didn't confront him?" I asked. "Not directly. Like all clever people carrying scars, she waited. And when Giles Torrington began his campaign to seize the estate, she watched him too. She allowed him just enough rope." I frowned. "And Giles?" Holmes leaned back. "Giles's motives were simple: greed and resentment. He learned of his disinheritance and forged a replacement will. He also planned, I believe, to kill his uncle. The crime itself was executed with frightening precision. He entered the study early, likely under the guise of reconciliation. He brought a blade, perhaps a surgical knife, judging by the wound, and struck when Felix turned his back. The room was then locked." Holmes shook his head. "Ah, but here lies the illusion. Giles did not exit the room at all. He remained hidden." The study had a concealed service hatch behind the lower bookshelf, a narrow opening that led through the walls to the butler's passage. It was long disused, sealed from the Grange's blueprints. But Giles, knowing the house from childhood, used it to escape. That is how he created the illusion of the locked room mystery. He retrieved a diagram and pointed. I later confirmed. The passage with the groundsman. He'd assumed it was bricked up decades ago. In fact, Giles had unsealed it in secret. That it explains why there was no evidence of forced entry or exit. The window was locked, the door was bolted, and yet the killer had vanished, and the candle. Holmes's expression turned thoughtful. The centerpiece of the deception. Giles purchased a mould designed to contain a heat-reactive wire. When lit, the wire gradually bends the candle, guiding the wax drip in a specific direction, thus creating the trail we observed. He used beeswax blended with lavender oil to replicate the kind used by Miss March. He reached into a drawer and removed one of the remaining samples. Then, after killing his uncle, he lit the candle and left it to burn. The bent wax trail was designed to suggest a time of death several hours later, giving Giles his alibi. But the candle, once spent, was removed by Giles through the same hidden passage. It was later replaced by Adela March, with the original, unburned, crooked and untouched, hidden behind the bookshelf. I blinked. Why would she do that? Holmes smiled faintly, because she was answering the deception with one of her own. She planted a candle of her own, a message, a symbol. She knew the forged will would fall apart under scrutiny, but she also knew Giles's guilt was not the full story. She needed to ensure the greater truth, the one about Felix, would emerge. He paused. That's why she staged her own disappearance. Why she placed a candle bearing Felix's initials in her room. Why she left the letter signed only as O. It was her way of forcing us, not merely to solve the murder, but to understand its cause. I sat back, exhaling. She played her role beautifully. Indeed, Holmes said. A quiet performance, an invisible hand shaping the truth without striking a blow. He looked toward the window. Giles Torrington will answer for the murder, but Adela March will never stand in any court, nor should she. Justice was done then. Holmes didn't answer right away. Then he said, justice perhaps. Truth, certainly, but resolution. He shook his head. No. Some things remain unresolved because they belong to history, not law. I nodded, then reached for my own pen. And what title will you give this case? I asked. The will that vanished? The house of fire? Holmes smiled slightly and stood. No, he said. Call it what it was. He lifted the final, unburned candle from his desk, still intact, still marked with a crooked lean. The case of the crooked candle. That was where the truth began to melt. Chapter 17. Outcome and justice news of the resolution at Greystone Grange spread through the London press like slow-burning fire. Carefully worded articles in the Times and the Telegraph described the incident as a gruesome inheritance crime, with a locked-room twist that baffled authorities, but was neatly resolved thanks to the intervention of a consulting detective of international renown. Holmes's name, naturally, was omitted. Scotland Yard, as always, accepted full credit. "Do you mind the omission?" I asked Holmes over breakfast one morning, the newspaper folded between us. "Not in the least," he replied without looking up from his toast. "Public credit is as fleeting as candlelight. And besides, if I wished to be mobbed by amateur dramatists asking for lectures on deduction, I'd stage a murder in Hyde Park." I laughed. Still, the case stirred imaginations. Letters have come in daily, some praising your genius, others asking if you intend to publish the full details. He waved a hand. "Let them speculate. The facts, Watson, the facts are ours." And the facts, as Holmes had explained in his meticulous reconstruction, led to a peculiar kind of justice. Giles Torrington had been formally charged with murder, forgery, and obstruction of an investigation. The evidence, both circumstantial and material, was overwhelming. The forged will, the candle moulds, the soot-rimmed service passage, and most damning of all, his own misplaced confidence had sealed his fate. He remained at the village jail, awaiting trial at the next assizes. Adela March, by contrast, had vanished completely. Despite telegrams sent across the continent and inquiries through Holmes's quiet network of informants, no trace of her had been found, not at any inn, not on any ferry manifest, nor at any Paris address under the name Ada Morton. It was as if she had melted into the fog, like wax in flame. "You don't think she's dead?" I had asked Holmes once. "No," he said. Adela March was never one for easy endings. There was a finality to the way he said it that discouraged further questions. Victor Osmond had returned to his quiet residence in Sussex, declining all interviews. His statement to the police was brief and focused solely on his correspondence with Sir Felix. He refused to implicate Adela or anyone else. She was the last child of the fire. He had told Holmes privately. Whatever she did, it was not out of malice, but memory. Holmes had nodded. I had spoken once with Clara Dimmock before we left the Grange for good. She was recovering well, though still pale and slightly shaken. "She saved me," Clara whispered, when I asked about the night she was struck. "Miss March?" Clara nodded. "I woke when someone crept through the corridor, carrying a candle. I thought it was the killer, but she didn't hurt me. She laid something beside me." Holmes had later found that object, a page from Sir Felix's private ledger, slipped under the linen cart. It listed payments to shell charities that never existed. She wanted it found, he told me. Even then, she was leaving trails. Passes. Hapwell resumed her duties, though she never again used the study. She had begun referring to it as that cursed room, and had, by her own insistence, moved Sir Felix's portrait from above the fireplace to a dark corner of the attic. "I don't want him watching over the house any more," she muttered. For Lionel Rivington, he oversaw the establishment of the Torrington Charitable Trust, exactly as dictated in the True Will. Funds were allocated to several orphanages, including one rebuilt on the grounds of St. Ignatius. Holmes received a letter of thanks from the new director, handwritten, reverent, and peppered with curiosity. "He asked if you might visit and speak to the children," I said, folding the letter one afternoon. Holmes raised an eyebrow. What on earth would I say to them? I smiled. That not all mysteries are about crime. Some are about hope or healing. He didn't answer. Instead, he rose and walked to the mantel, where a single candle now stood in a brass holder, not crooked, not burned, but pristine. A simple white taper. He lit it. We watched in silence as the flame caught and rose steady, its small glow illuminating the quiet room. "No tricks this time?" I asked. "None," he replied. "Just light." The room was filled with a gentle warmth. Then Holmes said something that surprised me. "I sometimes wonder," he murmured, "what would have happened had Adela March stayed?" I looked at him. "You admired her." "She understood the limits of justice," he said, "and the power of symbolism. That candle she left behind, it was not merely a clue, it was her voice, her defiance." He paused. "She turned a murder into a message." I let that settle for a moment, then said, "You did too? You made sure it was heard?" Holmes gave a rare smile. Perhaps, but it was she who lit the fuse. The candle burned slowly between us, a final echo of the crime that began with wax and flame and ended with silence and truth. ChatGPT said, Chapter 18, Holmes's Final Reflection. It was a quiet evening, weeks after the case of the crooked candle had come to a close. Spring had begun its slow reclamation of the London streets, and the bite of winter's breath had softened into a gentle, warming breeze that slipped in through the open window of 2B Baker Street. I had just returned from my surgery when I found Holmes seated by the fire, his violin resting across his knees. Though he had not played it, he sat deep in thought, the candle from Greystone Grange flickering softly beside him, its flame a slender dancing wisp in the darkened room. He looked up as I entered but did not rise. "I've written the final account," I said, placing a bound folio on the side table. "I've called it The Case of the Crooked Candle, just as you suggested." He nodded, eyes distant. "A fitting title?" I waited a moment before asking, "You've been quieter than usual, Holmes. Was it the case, or her?" He didn't answer immediately then. "Do you know, Watson, what makes a candle truly fascinating?" I smiled faintly. "I suspect you'll tell me." He turned to the flame. "It is one of the few objects whose destruction is its purpose. A candle exists to be consumed. Its light cannot shine without sacrifice. The longer it burns, the less of it remains. And yet, the more it illuminates." I said nothing. He continued, his voice low, reflective. "Sir Felix Torrington thought he could control the legacy of his sins with fire, by burning letters, destroying wills, and sealing away memory. But Adela March understood something far more profound. She knew that light lingers, that no matter how carefully one tries to obscure the truth, it always returns. Crooked, perhaps, softened by time, but never fully extinguished." He stood then, and approached the bookcase, where the photograph from St. Ignatius now sat, within a small silver frame. The faces of 4 children, blurred, distant, ghosts of a life long past. "She was that light," he said softly, "bent by experience, distorted by grief, but never broken." He turned back to me, and I saw in his face the rarest of expressions, a quiet, almost mournful respect. She never raised a hand, never spoke a threat, but she orchestrated more justice, with a whisper than Giles Torrington ever could with a knife. "You think she planned it all?" I asked. "From the beginning?" "No," he replied. "Not the murder. That was Giles's doing. But once it happened, she allowed it to play out. She guided the truth through shadows, manipulated the scene not for revenge, but for revelation. She forced a world that had ignored her to listen, and in doing so, she delivered justice not through violence, but through light." He walked to the table, extinguished the candle, and stood a moment longer in the residual glow. "I often claim that deduction is cold, logical, that sentiment clouds judgment. But perhaps," he paused, "perhaps I am not always right." I raised an eyebrow. "You, Holmes, admitting fallibility. Shall I mark the calendar?" He gave me a dry smile. "Mark it with wax." We both laughed, the sound easy, natural. Then he grew serious once more. "Watson," he said. "Should the world ask what happened at Greyston Grange, tell them the truth, not the one that hangs from courtroom verdicts or newspaper columns. The deeper truth, that a life extinguished in silence can still cast light long after it's gone. That sometimes it is not the crime that defines the story." He glanced once more toward the candle, now dark, but the flame that follows it. The room grew quiet once more. Outside, the city stirred with the sounds of life. Cab wheels rattled. Distant laughter echoed. Somewhere, a bell chimed 7. Holmes returned to his chair, stretched his long fingers across the violin strings, and drew the bow gently, just once, across the gut. The note hung in the air, quivering like memory. Then it faded, and the case of the crooked candle was at last complete.